Hello, I am Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at the Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee, Children's.
I'm here to talk more about fairies. This is our second dive into the exciting world of fairies. What do you think so far? Have you learned a lot?
I have. It's just, I'm enthralled.
Yeah, it's an amazing part of folklore. Something that a lot of people know about fairies but don't know a lot of the details. So we'll do a recap of what we discussed last time. Fairies don't like iron, so you can drive fairies away with iron. Never give a fairy your true name. Always be very respectful and be very careful what you say around fairies. All right, so if you feel like you're prepared now, because unfortunately, a lot of this doesn't apply to every fairy.
Okay.
Right. Before we get into that, where do fairies come from? There's lots of stories. J.M. Barrie said that the first time a baby laughs, it creates a fairy. He was probably exaggerating a little bit. I think that's poetry. You also probably can't bring a fairy back to life by clapping, but it worked for Tinkerbell. I discussed last time, there's a belief that fairies represent the previous inhabitants of the British Islands, Scotland and Ireland and so forth, who were driven out when people came from across the sea to invade them. That fairies really represent that prior race of people that lived there who were all rendered extinct. There's another version of that they actually represent old gods. That they're once the mighty gods of Celtic mythology, and then they literally dwindled in size till they became mere fairies. And there is a lot of fairies interwoven with Celtic mythology quite a bit.
Okay.
However, when Christianity came along, Christianity has to explain everything in terms of God or the devil, so they came forth with the theory that fairies are actually fallen angels. They didn't actually follow Lucifer to hell because they hadn't actually done anything wrong, but they can't stay in heaven anymore. So they're in that midpoint between heaven and hell. There's also the association between fairies and the dead.
I hadn't heard that one at all.
Yes, there's a part of fairy lore that's very much associated with death. The word for fairy is the Sidhe, S-I-D-H-E, and Sidhe literally translates as mound of earth. And in the old days, they buried people in burial mounds. So farmers would dig into them and find bones and armor and things like that from people who were long dead. And that became the origin of people living under the earth. So in a sense, the Sidhe make their homes in burial mounds.
Okay.
And gosh, that sounds like they're kind of undead of some sort. There was definitely a version of the Sidhe who were undead, and those are known as the Slua. They flew through the air for some reasons. They're cursed to wander the world forever. They're undead fairies, essentially. They're famous for stealing children and doing evil things like that. And they're the ones that you kept a horseshoe to keep away, anything iron to keep them away. They were pure evil.
Okay. What would they have looked like? Because when you said undead, I didn't know if you literally meant zombie apocalypse undead or...
The Slua probably looked like that. They probably had pasty skin and had twisted, grotesque bodies. I'm not sure if they were rotted at all. They were, unclean spirits. They flew through the air, which most fairies didn't. They're referred to as the host of the ungrateful dead, that kind of thing.
So is there any indication of why they have flight?
I'm not sure, except possibly that they're considered a type of ghosts, and ghosts aren't material enough to be affected by gravity.
Okay.
In the Changeling role-playing game from White Wolf, the Slua were essentially like goth kids. They all looked they had pale skin and black hair and lots of piercings and tattoos and kind of a sullen attitude towards life. So the Slua and the Changeling were reinterpreted as goth.
Okay.
One thing I forgot to mention last week when I was talking about locating fairies at crossroads, my wife berated me for not mentioning ley lines. Are you familiar with ley lines at all?
We talked about them in not last week's session, but the one before that, when we were kind of diving into a little bit about everything, and there was the book that had the layout of the subway or the...
Yeah, from Neverwhere, yeah. So ley lines were someone noticed that a bunch of the ancient pagan sites all line up with each other. And it's possible to take like a map of England, this is where he started, and draw straight lines between different historical sites and famous buildings and things like that. And so the idea developed, this is something that energy, geomantic energy of the earth flowed along these lines. And so people who wanted to work magic could set up things on the ley lines. And so running into a Fae along the ley lines was always a possibility, much more likely than anywhere else. So keeping track of your ley lines was always very useful. It's also possible that most of the ancient sites that are being examined by archaeologists were used for astrological purposes. And if they're lined up along the same meridian, it's possibly because they're meant to line up with the same star or the same constellation.
Well, that's interesting because there are tunnels under, is it the Colosseum?
Mm-hmm.
And even the layout of DC is in a very specific pattern.
Yeah, it's a very geometric pattern. There's a whole science and an art to laying out cities along lines of power and things like that. Even if you don't believe in magic, there's a psychological thing about laying out a city. Boston and New York are very different cities and have a very different feel to them, partly because Boston has totally random streets, and Manhattan's done a lot of it with a grid pattern.
There's a funny meme about that.
Yeah, it's but it's true, and both cities have a different character and a different nature to them.
Mm-hmm.
And the big question that people who study like urban legends and things like that is the character of the city determined by its layout, or does the layout determine the nature of the city?
Wow, that's interesting.
What caused it?
Huh.
Was Boston the way it is because of the way it was laid out, or is it the exact opposite?
I'd have to think
It
that
is.
one over.
It is something. Yeah, it's something to discuss. I was at a convention where they were talking about magical cities and things like that, and how the city, the kind of characters you use in your fiction, where they live determines what kind of people that they will be. In a magical city, you'll have that aspect of magical to them. And I said, and I asked a question from the audience, like, are they magical because they live in a magical city, or is the city magical because magical people live there? The person said, yes.
Well, am I wrong in thinking that that's very much, did the chicken or the egg come first?
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those questions you really can't answer. Now, there are some fairies that are kind of unique, and they're not necessarily the ones that you can drive away with iron, and they don't go for the whole bargaining thing. There is a character known as the Lianan She. She's one of the She, definitely, like the Bane She and the Nianan She. Lianan literally means fairy mistress.
Okay.
And she would take on human lovers.
So like succubus?
Kind of, yes. She is a succubus. She's a kind of succubus. She'll take on human lovers and drain the life of them. But what's interesting about her, what makes her unique, is that she's also a muse. Apparently someone in the old times noticed how poets and artists and writers and so forth tended to be really super creative, but also burn themselves out really quickly and suffer from depression and alcoholism and so forth. And the explanation for that was it was Lianan. She's generally considered a unique Fae. There's not like a species of her. She is one. There is one Lianan She. And many of the famous poets of Ireland in particular, who were alcoholic and depressed and sometimes suicidal because of Lianan.
Interesting.
Yeah, the idea of the muse as something that drives you to suicide is kind of, it's a very Irish concept. I used it myself in a role-playing game that my wife played. In the Elizabethan times, Christopher Marlowe had Lianan as his muse, and he was famously did not live to become very old. And she tried to leave him and attach herself to Shakespeare, but fortunately my wife stopped that from happening. Now,
so can she be overcome?
Sometimes, yes. It's hard though, because for the most part, the people that she's with, apart from being very attractive and seductive, she gives you creativity. She gives you that fire that keeps you going. And if you're an artist or a writer, you don't want to lose that. Some of them will do anything to keep that inspiration. And similar to her is the Bhavan She. They're sometimes called the Bhavan Sith in Wikipedia in particular. And Sith, of course, is a word made famous by George Lucas in the Star Wars movies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they have any actual connection to Dark Fairies, but the word is the same. The Bavanshi are fairy vampires. They combine the seductive nature of the Fae with the seductive nature of vampires, so you can imagine they're really super dangerous. They're apparently not that common because there's literally only one story involving the Bavanshi. And when you look them up in any book of folklore, you get this single story by a bunch of guys who were out in the woods and they had, around the campfire, and a group of beautiful women appeared. And one of them sang, and the rest of them danced with the men. And the guy who wasn't dancing noticed his friends were getting paler and paler, and saw like drops of blood on the ground. As they were dancing, they were slowly drawing the blood out of them. So the one guy ran and jumped on his horse, and they came after him, but the iron of the horseshoes kept him away. So he was the lone survivor who lived to tell the tale.
Okay.
So
that would be sort of similar to Peter Piper, right?
Similar, yeah. Again, the seductive nature of the fairies is one of the things that's very prevalent in all the stories.
Okay.
Another very singular character in fairy folklore is Morgan Le Fay from the King Arthur legends. Her name is literally Le Fay. She is Morgan the Fae.
Is she ever, did I miss in any of the times that I've watched any of those movies, or is she presented as a fairy?
Not a traditional fairy, but she obviously has fairy blood. She had a mortal mother, clearly, but she is considered a queen of the fairy realms. And some of the versions of the story, she's one of the one who takes Arthur's body to Avalon after he's killed. He's taken under the water to Avalon, the Isle of Apples, to return to England when in its hour of direst need. But she's considered a queen of the Fae, even though she was born to a mortal mother in the mortal realm. Like I said, her name is literally Morgan the Fairy. And that's where all of her magic comes from. But she's not someone who's worried about iron or anything like that. So she's that powerful. Morgan was added to the legend by the French chroniclers. She wasn't a part of any of the Welsh or English versions of the King Arthur story, but she was added at a slightly later date.
By the French, you said?
Yes. That's why it's La Faye.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of obvious once it's pointed out, but I read Arthur books for a long time without noticing that little fact.
The way that I kind of interpret it was that she could wield magic, not necessarily that she was magical.
Yeah. Apparently in the early version she is magical. She was a pure-hearted villain in the early stories. Most modern interpretations treat her more sympathetically. She's even very heroic in some versions of it.
But not the case in the original.
Not the original. The original, she was just evil. She was Arthur's half-sister.
Any explanation of why she was evil?
Well, she was Arthur's half-sister. They both had the same mother.
Mm-hmm.
However, Morgan knew that King Arthur was actually created through an act of rape.
Mm-hmm.
Uther Pendragon, using Merlin's magic, took this woman, Igraine, I believe was her name, and she was gotten with child, and that child was Arthur.
Right.
Now, needless to say, Morgan resented that quite a bit, that her mother had been taken that way through a foul trick by Merlin. In the John Borman movie Excalibur, Morgan, as a little girl, actually watches her mother being taken by Merlin's magic and never forgave Arthur for that. In some versions of the story, she sleeps with Arthur and produces a child who becomes Mordred, who would famously go on to actually kill Arthur. In other versions, there's actually two sisters, and it's not Morgan, it's her sister Morgase that actually gives birth to Mordred. There's several different versions of the story. But seeing her as a woman trying to avenge a horrible wrong done to her mother gives her a lot more sympathy. So it says famous fairies. The most famous fairies come from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. Shakespeare was responsible for quite a bit of fairy lore. He uses whatever kind of fairies fit the story that he wants to tell. In one of Shakespeare's plays, he mentions Queen Mab, who flies along invisibly and pinches you, which is the image of fairies as being tiny winged creatures.
So he created these concepts or he researched them?
He probably didn't do any real research. He just used things that he's heard and picked up over the years. But he used both the image of fairies as being tiny winged creatures, and then he also created Oberon and Titania, the king and queen of the fairy realms, for Midsummer Night's Dream. Oberon and Titania, and of course Puck, who was pretty much the archetype of the Faye trickster fellow.
Okay.
Who isn't really evil, but is usually responsible for a lot of like ridiculous things happening.
Mm-hmm.
He's responsible for much of the confusion of Midsummer Night's Dream. Fairy experts believe that Oberon and Titania as names were not associated with the Fae until Shakespeare. He may have just made that up because fairy lore is very changeable and nebulous, like the Fae themselves. So there hadn't been a real king or queen of fairy, but Shakespeare needed names for his characters, and so he used them. And today, many people speak of Titania as if it's always been a fairy name, and it really hasn't. Not until Shakespeare put it down on paper. There are fairy creatures or fae of some sort in every part of the world. Many of them are not connected to the cycle of stories that come out of the Celtic folklore. The stories from England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, and so forth are the ones that we're talking about. For instance, in Northern Europe, in like Norway and Sweden and so forth, you have gnomes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever wonder why people have garden gnomes?
To protect the space,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, the short little guys with the big red caps and beards and so forth. They are the guardians of nature. They will help your plants grow and protect it from predators and so forth. There's a really cool series of cartoons called David the Gnome, dealing with a gnome living in the woods and taking care of animal friends and helping heal them and solving various problems. They're very cute stories. And they weren't animated by an American company. There's a European animation company, so they have a nice different feel to them than kids would be used to.
Right.
Also in Northern Europe, you have the Holder folk. Holder folk are the hidden ones. There's a theory or a belief that back in the early days, God came to visit Adam and Eve was in the process of washing all of her children. And because some of them hadn't been washed yet and were very dirty, she didn't want God to see them. Apparently forgetting that God was omniscient and knew about them anyway. So she hid her kids away from God's eyes. And so because of that, they were in a sense cursed to always be hidden. And so they were the hidden folk who evolved more or less alongside humanity. And they had magic powers, they lived in the woods, they all had some animal trait to them. There were women who were known as holder women, who generally had an animal's tail, sometimes a cow's tail, sometimes a goat's tail. And they were, see if this sounds familiar, they seduced the men in the woods and either killed them or drove them insane. That apparently happened a lot back in old Europe. Magical women were popping out of nowhere and seducing men. If you imagine these stories were invented by guys who spent a lot of time alone in the woods, you would probably be absolutely right. Because almost every country has some story about a magical woman who shows up and seduces a guy, and normally bad things happen. They almost never get away with it. The only good version of the magical woman who appears in the woods is the Blanche Dames, the white women of France. And the white women appear in several other cultures too. The women dressed entirely in white who are in the woods, and you encounter them, and they will generally dance with you. And if you refuse them, they'll get angry and probably kill you. So you treat them very politely, you go along with it, even though it's kind of silly dancing with a woman in the woods. But if you're friendly and nice to them, they will sometimes give you presents, give you a treasure of some sort. But they're really only angry, and will hurt you if you ignore them or cross them. So they're more of a benign, sort of neutral magic woman who lives in the woods.
They just want to dance?
They just want to dance, apparently. Yeah, they're French, In Russia, you have the rusalka, which is a type of water fairy who likes to drown people. That is also extremely common in folklore. Most cultures have a water creature that will drown people. In England, they had the character known as Jenny Greenteeth. So called because I'm sure her teeth were the color of moss that grows in still water. She was Jenny Greenteeth, and she would lure children to the edge of the water and drown them. So that was the warning that if the kids played near the water, they'll be taken by Jenny Greenteeth. And the kappa in Japan were creatures that were somewhat turtle-like, who would also drown children if they came too close to the water. So these are all parts of cautionary legends that were told to children.
Okay.
The Kappa have the additional part of their legend in that in Japan, kids are taught to be very respectful. And the Kappa have an indent in their heads that is always filled with water that gives them some of their power. And if you meet a Kappa and you bow to him, he will have to bow to you in return, and he'll spill all the water out of his skull, and then has to go running back to the water again without hurting you. It was a good lesson that Japanese children to always be respectful, particularly with monsters that crossed you, on a road in Japan. All these important things that kids learn from fairy tales. You had mentioned the Jinn earlier in another session. The Jinn they're not called fairies or Faye, but they are magical creatures. They come from the Middle East. They're mentioned in the Quran, so they're definitely a part of modern Islamic thought today. Today they're treated more like ghosts or minor demons or things like that. But they were created by Allah out of smokeless fire. Man was created from clay, they were created from smokeless fire. So they're always associated with flames and smoke and things like that. That's why you often see genies, which is the plural of jinn. You often see genies traveling in like a cloud of smoke and that kind of thing. That's sort of their whole deal. They had magic powers, they had free will, so they could be good or evil. Some of them were evil and nasty, some of them were nice to you. They could do all kinds of things, and you could make a bargain with them to accomplish some task. And they would always stick to their end of the bargain. But they could also be very treacherous and trick you. If you ask for a room full of gold, they'll open up a hole in the ceiling and gold showers you and crushes you to death and that kind of thing. You have to be very specific in your wording when you're making a wish to a jinn. That comes up in D&D a lot too, Dungeons and Dragons.
So does that mean that if they can find a way to be harmful or bad, so to speak, that they default to that? Or
Some
just that
of them will. They have free will. There were some that would never dream of doing that. They were also, they were male and female, and they apparently, in some of the stories, they have their own civilization in another dimension. They have a whole homeland of the jinn that's somewhere not quite in this world. Did you ever wonder why so many genies are trapped inside lamps?
Sure.
It was a common occupational hazard for genies to get trapped inside things. But it all goes back to King Solomon, back in Jerusalem.
How so?
Well, Solomon was the wisest king in the world, it says in the Old Testament, in the Torah.
Okay.
And of course, he was master of all things, including magic.
Okay.
And when he wanted to build the Temple of Solomon, the most fabulous building that had ever been constructed at that time period, he naturally summoned jinn to build it for him. And so that's why the Temple of Solomon was constructed so perfectly, because it was done magically by jinn. And they also built the walls around Jerusalem to protect it, which didn't work that well in the long run for Jerusalem, but again. However, the jinn were very difficult to deal with. They started to fill up the whole area and cause trouble and get out of hand. So Solomon trapped them. He sealed them inside various things. Originally, it wasn't just a lamp. An oil lamp is the traditional thing. He sealed them inside bottles, inside gems, inside of rings, and so forth. He trapped them, and no one knows exactly how he trapped them. The spells that Solomon used to control jinn is one of those things in magical circles that no one really knows how he did it. The assumption is he used the tetragrammaton. The tetragrammaton is the magical name of God, which he of course knew, being King Solomon. And the name of God can be written inside of a 5-pointed star, which makes the tetragrammaton a pentagram.
Okay.
And that he would use this, there's a theory that he had it on his ring, and we use this to seal bottles shut and trap the genie inside until it's opened. And then the genie would have to obey usually 3 wishes to the person that freed him. But to this day, in magical circles, in Wicca and things like that, the 5-pointed star, the pentagram, is used for summoning. You can summon a spirit to talk to it and trap it inside the pentagram, or you can be inside the pentagram yourself for protection when you summon something that's to the outside. And that all goes back to ancient times with King Solomon and trapping the jinn.
Wow.
The indigenous people of every country had some version of magical folk. I think I mentioned the Bantu of Africa had the Wakyambi, who are people who had tails. They lived in the clouds, actually. They're known as the heaven people. And they would climb down to earth on particularly tall trees to interact with people. There's a legend among the Bantu that one of the Wakayambi was trapped here and couldn't get back up again. And he realized he was the only one around with a tail, so he felt bad about that and cut it off. But he became the ancestor of all the Bantu people, which is how they know that even though they look like everybody else in the whole, Congo region, they actually are descended from a magical heaven person. Very useful story. In Hawaii, they had the Menehune, who were tiny people. They were more like gnomes and dwarves and things like that. They were enormously strong and they were great craftsmen. They would build things. And one of the tricks to them is that they would only work at night. And when the sun rose, if they weren't finished, they would walk away from the project and never come back to it. And they had lived in Hawaii before the Polynesians arrived. So when they arrived, they actually found like half-finished huts and partially done canoes and things like that they finished themselves. That they were enormously useful little people. They mostly could only be seen by children,
Okay.
which is another thing about fairies. That makes them much more like fairies. They can only be seen by children for the most part. Although a Menehune was used as a mascot for United Airlines when they had their direct service to Honolulu for a while.
Really?
Yes, they became an advertising gimmick. A sad fate for a proud Faye race, but and more locally, the Wampanoag talked about the Pukwudgies.
Not
You heard about
familiar with that.
Yes,
no.
they lived in the woods. They were tiny, dark-skinned people who had all kinds of magical powers. They could make fire by snapping their fingers. They could make things appear and disappear. The Wampanoags believed that they were originally helpful and beneficial, but they got really tired of everybody moving into their woods and chopping down their trees and things like that. So shortly after the arrival of the Europeans, they started getting pushed deeper and deeper into the woods. They became more sullen and resentful. And today, if you see one, he's probably going to be a trickster up to no good. Because they really soured their nature by taking away all the land they used to live on.
Well, 1 + 1.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a little bit of the resentment against the Europeans that comes out in their folklore in that. But there's still sightings of Pukwudgies to this day in urban legends and things like that if you go online.
Does that have anything to do with the story, The Indian in the Cupboard?
I don't think so. As far as I know, it doesn't. I am a librarian and I've got tons of books here to talk about. Probably more than we possibly have time for. A lot of my fairy lore comes from the Encyclopedia of Fairies by Catherine Briggs. This is the first book I read on fairies. She goes through tons of stuff, much more than we could ever possibly cover here. It's an encyclopedia, so it's not meant to be read cover to cover, but I have twice. It's that good. It is so full of ideas. I use this kind of stuff in my role-playing games for the books that I write all the time, literally. The Great Encyclopedia of Fairies, not to be confused with several other Encyclopedia of Fairies. I picked this one from my collection at the library because it mostly comes from European sources. That's where the Blanche Gnomes comes from, the description I just gave you. So it mostly has French and German Fae. And they also are very broad with how they define a fairy. They include Valkyries along with that from Norse mythology. Valkyries were invisible, they walked along the battlefield and were choosers of the dead, which makes them kind of fairy-like. Fairies could also choose the dead in some terms of folklore. One of the myths from England was that on New Year's Eve at midnight, if you walked past a churchyard, you would see the Fae dancing with people. And they're dancing with people who are all going to die in the next year.
All right.
Yeah. Stardust by Neil Gaiman. I've mentioned Neil Gaiman every week for several weeks in a row now because we just can't stop talking about him. This is a whole book based on fairy lore about a kid who goes into the fairy realms to get a valuable prize for a girl that he loves, or thinks that he loves, and winds up having a whole series of magical adventures that awakens his eyes to the much broader world. And this one, there's literally a town that has a hole in the fence that you can walk through and be in the fairy realm, which makes the town a really dangerous place. Last week you were looking at Fairies by Brian Froud and Alan Lee. This is one of the books that came out, I think, in the 70s. It's been around for a long time. It's never been out of print. I've gone through several copies here in the library because people keep stealing it, or they read it till it falls apart. I was really happy when someone donated this hardcover because the paperback one doesn't last very long because so many people want to read it, and they also copy ideas for tattoos out of it. The one you're looking at right now, Drawing Down the Moon, is by Charles Bess. Vess, I think, is one of the best modern interpreter of what fairies look like. That I described trooping fairies who travel along on horseback. That is the Queen of Elfame and her trooping fairies. That is exactly what he has drawn there. He did the illustrations for Stardust. So this is definitely like Charles Vess's like fairy lore. My favorite fairy artist they don't have a book of is Arthur Rackham. He did stuff like many years ago. He did a lot of fantastic illustrations for the early printings of Peter Pan and a whole bunch of Grimm fairy tales and so forth. I also have Realms by Tony DiTerlizzi. I had mentioned the Changeling role-playing game a while ago. Tony DiTerlizzi became more famous recently for the Spiderwick Chronicles that he wrote with Holly Black.
Right.
He has a marvelous eye for fairy lore, much like Charles Vess or Arthur Rackham. He did the illustrations for White Wolf's Changeling role-playing game, and also a lot of magical creatures for the Dungeons and Dragons game. In fact, there's a whole monster supplement, I believe a Planescape supplement, that he drew every single monster in the book, which is very rare for one artist to be asked to do an entire, Dungeons and Dragons book. But he had that honor. There's a lot more to talk about, but I don't want to go on too long. What do you think? Are you overwhelmed?
I'm not overwhelmed, but I'm inspired, and the detail in these drawings is just incredible. And the individuality, again, just going back to the imagination, and it's not redundant in any way. It's so unique.
Yeah, you see the same themes hit again and again. A magical creature that drowns children, a woman who seduces men in the woods. But at the same time, each country, each area has its own unique take on that.
Just stunning.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's so gorgeous, the stuff that he does. He's also done some magic cards, because of course. That is all the time we have for today. We will be back next time with even more exciting stuff to talk about.
All right, I'm looking forward to it.
All right. I am Ed from the Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire.
And we'll see you all next time. Take care of yourself and be safe.